My name is Christy Arman, and it's my honor to welcome you here today and to introduce Nick Hunter, the Mayor of Lake Charles.
All right, good morning, everyone. It was not lost on us when we decided to throw this thing together that if we chose today as the date, we were testing fate a little bit. But I just want us to look outside the windows real quick and acknowledge it is a beautiful day in Lake Charles today. So, how does a city go from being dubbed by the Weather Channel as America's most weather-battered city to 4 years later, one of America's most resilient cities? Today, among other things, we aim to answer that question. Today, you'll hear from those who have been in the trenches, and we hope that many of these lessons can be captured for posterity, especially for other communities along the Gulf Coast. On August 27th, 2020, 4 years ago today, Hurricane Laura, the fifth strongest hurricane to make landfall in recorded American history, roared onshore in southwest Louisiana. A short 6 weeks later, Hurricane Delta roared onshore in southwest Louisiana, adding insult to injury. As we struggled to recover, in February 2021, Winter Storm Uri brought days of freezing weather to the area, causing pipes in homes and businesses across the city to burst. And as if that's not enough, in May 2021, a 1,000-year rain event made its way through Lake Charles. A 1,000-year rain event is not made up by me. That's an official term, dumping close to 20 inches of rain in mere hours, causing devastating flooding, meaning some homeowners now faced the prospect of replacing sheetrock in their homes for the third or fourth time in a matter of 10 months. Oh yeah, and let's not forget a couple other small things that were happening nationally. A little pandemic was occurring. The worst pandemic we've had in about 100 years, and I think it's safe to say it was one of the most controversial federal transfers of power, one of the most controversial in our nation's history. So it was quite a ride. City infrastructure and assets were heavily damaged as a result of the natural disasters. Our public works campus was torn to shreds, the same for multiple fire and police stations. Water and wastewater plants were not spared either. One city employee, and this is a literal quote, I remember, said this. He said that he felt that when he visited one of the water plants, it was almost as if Hurricane Laura had taken a mallet and smashed it into the ground. It was spread across a field like a Lego set. So imagine the nightmare scenario of carefully placed roadside storm debris from one hurricane being swept away by a second hurricane 6 weeks later. Imagine the nightmare scenario where a hurricane-ravaged city encounters a once-in-a-generation freeze, where thousands of private water lines burst throughout the city, many in still vacant houses. The strain this put on our water system was incredible. Imagine the personal, emotional, and financial toll all of this takes on a citizenry. To get knocked down on August 27th, 2020, and again on October 9th, 2020, and again in mid-February 2021, and again on May 17th, 2021, you can't blame some of us for thinking literally, what have we done, Lord, to deserve this? In the aftermath of this string of natural disasters, the devastation was clear and present. The path to recovery was less so. State and local officials never predicted the fight that would lay ahead for a commensurate and equitable response from the federal government. Following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, it took 10 days for affected areas to receive an allocation of Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery dollars, commonly called CDBG-DR, a term I have become very familiar with. By comparison, the first trickle of CDBG-DR for areas affected by Hurricane Laura would eventually come over 400 days after our storms. 400. The path has been arduous at times, seemingly insurmountable. There were times where I personally felt like the only thing I knew more to do was just to pray. In the end, this community reaffirmed through solidarity that we have grit in our veins here. To take a page out of Churchill's book, we never gave up and we would never surrender. Ultimately, we received the support we needed. Some are still waiting, but by and large, we received the support we needed, and now we are keenly focused on today and tomorrow. More so than yesterday, but to be sure, we and others should learn from what this community went through, but we cannot dwell only on the inadequacies. Today we can also dwell on things like the Herculean partnership between the cities, Gravity Drainage Districts, and the Calcasieu Parish Police Jury, a partnership that has led to drainage receiving more attention and investment over the last couple years than it has in probably the last 50 years. An investment that totals, and these are real figures, over $200 million, most of which has been reimbursed by federal sources. I can confidently say, and we're not finished, by the way, but I can confidently say that today drainage is superior in this city to what it was pre-Hurricane Laura. We can dwell on the unprecedented investment our water and wastewater systems have received. Construction is well underway on a new water treatment plant, which will improve and maintain water quality and increase capacity by 30%. This is the largest investment in our water system in over 30 years. I want to thank Wagner Engineering, who has expertly designed this new plant and made sure that the city has benefited from multiple federal and state funding sources. The city has leveraged federal American Rescue Plan dollars to upgrade our antiquated water metering system. We are close to completion on installing automated water meter technology on the more than 30,000 meters citywide. Reimagine that nightmare scenario I mentioned in 2021 where we had hundreds, some say over 1,500 water leaks on private lines. We had dozens of city employees literally driving the streets trying to identify where these leaks were with their naked eyes. Our engineers estimate that today, that event in 2021 where we lost sufficient water pressure for 5 days, if that happened again today with this new system, that would be about a day, perhaps a day and a half, without sufficient water pressure, because today, one employee, one person sitting in a room looking at a computer screen can print off a list of every address in the city where there's a leak, and employees can be strategically deployed. Thanks to FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, we also have additional drainage, water, and wastewater resiliency projects underway. All city buildings were and are either being repaired or rebuilt to higher wind load standards. In the coming months, we'll be breaking ground on a brand new public works campus and a brand new fire admin and training campus for the city of Lake Charles, both of which are geographically placed and designed to be able to support this city's growth for the next 100 years. The combined investment of these campuses represents over $40 million, and quite frankly, without FEMA, these projects would have never been possible. They would have been on the back burner, for sure. Thanks to collaborative efforts between government and the private sector, citizens of Lake Charles now have more options when it comes to reliable internet service in our community, something absolutely essential in the year 2024. I want to particularly call out and thank Vexus, who is currently well underway using private funds to install underground fiber throughout every neighborhood in the city of Lake Charles. 2 weeks ago, I participated in a groundbreaking event for Entergy, whereby they plan to spend over $100 million on the Lake Charles region alone, strengthening 148 miles of power lines. Thanks to the stellar Council of Louisiana Radio Communications, emergency communications towers have been rebuilt stronger with the latest technology and with room to grow. We have seen an incredible housing rebound. I started compiling these notes a couple weeks ago, and the data that I had at that time showed that thanks to housing programs administered by the city and the state of Louisiana, over 500 homeowners in single-family homes have been assisted since Hurricane Laura, just in the city of Lake Charles, in either complete rebuilds or renovations, reestablishing those individuals in healthy, sustainable housing. But yesterday, I received updated numbers. So I can now say that thanks to housing programs administered by the city and the state of Louisiana, over 740 homeowners in the city of Lake Charles alone have been assisted since Hurricane Laura in reestablishing themselves in healthy, sustainable housing. And keep in mind, this statistic only deals with homeowners. New rental housing investments like Capstone at the Oaks, Woodring downtown, and Calcasieu Heights, just to name a few, are all well underway. And within the next 6 months, as we have these units come online, the City of Lake Charles can say that we will have more rental units in the City of Lake Charles than we had pre-Hurricane Laura. Secure, healthy, attainable housing in Lake Charles is more of a reality today than it has been in decades. Later today, you'll hear from Josh Collin with Woodring developer HRI about what in the hell they were thinking when they decided to invest in the most weather-battered city in America. Additionally, thanks to the fortified gold construction standards, the City of Lake Charles can claim to be the most resilient city in the entire state of Louisiana for housing per capita. I'm going to say that again because I know I'm an elected official, and I know sometimes we pull stuff out of a hat and it just sounds good, but this is not hyperbole, this is not an exaggeration. Because of the fortified gold standards for the entire state of Louisiana, the City of Lake Charles can claim to be the most resilient city from a housing perspective in this entire state. And the City of Lake Charles and the Lake Charles Housing Authority joined only 6 other cities nationwide, most of which had populations much larger than ours and resources much more plentiful than we had. We joined 6 other cities in 2023 when we were awarded a Housing and Urban Development Choice Neighborhood Initiative grant. When combined with other private and public funds, this $40 million grant is expected to have a total impact of over $150 million into the heart of the city. For any mid-sized American city, the announcement of a Choice Neighborhood Initiative grant alone would be enough to use language like generational, game changer, revolutionary. And for us, this is yet again just one of dozens of such announcements locally. CDBG-DR is allowing for multiple additional projects. To name a few: wastewater collection, system rehabs, an indoor recreational multi-purpose facility, which will double as an emergency management center and temporary shelter. Second Harvest warehouse and food prep site, associated builders and contractors, Lake Charles campus, investments in street corridors for low to moderate income areas, a teen center, a disaster nonprofit hub, and a business incubator with a keen focus on micro enterprises and minority-owned businesses. Economic Development Administration grants are making way for a new Mardi Gras museum, an investment which Visit Lake Charles has spearheaded, and a flight school will be established here in Lake Charles, a partnership between the city, Chenault International Airport, and Sewella Technical Community College. The flight school also represents a further step towards economic diversity. Sewella and McNeese campuses are buzzing with activity, and both are emerging to exist as some of the newest and most advanced campuses in the entire state of Louisiana. Thanks to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Climate Resilient Skills Training Program grant, the Sewella Flood Mitigation Training Program will focus on structural elevation and dry flood proofing. The goal is to create good jobs that advance climate resilience and environmental justice, develop a 21st century workforce that is climate literate, and address challenges such as escalating insurance premiums and asset devaluation. This May, McNeese hosted a groundbreaking ceremony for the LNG Center of Excellence, which will be located on campus. What began with a grant from the U.S. Department of Commerce has evolved into a transformative project with support from public and private sectors. When complete, it will serve as the premier national center for training, research, and collaboration on LNG issues and innovation. The center will include classrooms, training facilities where both McNeese students and LNG employees can learn while operating process equipment in a safe, controlled environment. You will also hear today about the Just Imagine SWLA 50-year Resilience Master Plan and LC Rebound. Just Imagine SWLA was made possible by a generous donation from David and Angela Philo. David was one of the co-founders of Yahoo and grew up here in Southwest Louisiana. Just Imagine SWLA is organized around 5 topics: collaborative community planning, resilient housing, diverse and strong economy, reliable and resilient infrastructure, and natural and cultural resources. Catalytic projects outlined in this plan are highly visible and should be implemented in the first 10 years. I don't know if implementable is a word, but if it's not, it should be, because I remember when Sarah Judson came to talk to me about this idea for a new master plan, my response was, Sarah, I will participate, but I don't want to participate in a plan that's just going to sit on the shelf and collect dust. And I think we have avoided that in spades, and I think that what we have come up with is very implementable. Using these catalytic projects as a partial guide, City of Lake Charles voters showed up in November of 2023 and passed LC Rebound, a tax-neutral bond that has modernized the city's tax structure and will allow for close to an additional $200 million worth of infrastructure and quality of life projects, many of which we'll be breaking ground on in a matter of weeks. Thanks to the tax restructuring aspect of LC Rebound, the City of Lake Charles's fiscal outlook is the greatest it's been probably in our history. Thanks to city support and support from a myriad of other public and private agencies, the Center for New Urbanism awarded the Just Imagine SWA Master Plan with a Charter Award this year at their conference in Cincinnati. All of this was a quick overview, and a quick overview of the strides that have been made over the last 4 years. I'm getting into the most dangerous part of my comments, where I want to thank a few people. And I thought long and intensely about this section, because undoubtedly there will be some individuals that don't specifically get called out. But I have to specifically take a moment to especially thank the team of Hunt, Guyot, and Associates. HGA has been embedded at City Hall since the early aftermath of Hurricane Laura. Those employees have become almost like family. They've served as our FEMA and CDBG-DR consultants, and I understand it's probably typical and expected for a FEMA consultant firm to remain somewhat uncelebrated in a corner, but I feel an obligation to reaffirm to the HGA team and partners that without a doubt, you all have played an irreplaceable and essential role in saving the City of Lake Charles. You helped bring us back from the brink, and the history books would be incomplete if they don't mention HGA in Lake Charles's Hurricane Laura recovery story. I want to thank my team at City Hall, the department and division heads, and every employee of the City of Lake Charles. Your tireless efforts were valiant, and they are appreciated every day. And again, I'm hesitant to start calling out names, but I got to do at least one. There are so many people who deserve acknowledgement and thanks, but I'm not going to be honest with myself and this entire community if I don't thank Paul Rainwater by name. Paul was a guiding light for me. He was my therapist at times, many times. He told me how things would go on the federal level. There were times where I yelled at Paul. There were some times where I cursed at Paul. He would inevitably pull me back from the ledge. He would remind me that the White House and Congress, believe it or not, actually had more on their plate than Hurricane Laura recovery. And he would tell me once again how things would go. And ultimately, he was right, and I will be forever grateful to him. We are especially honored today that the FEMA Administrator, Deanna Criswell, is joining us, serving as our luncheon keynote speaker. I know it's fashionable and politically expedient to sometimes throw stones at the federal government or FEMA as it relates to natural disaster. It's easy and cheap to say, to hell with FEMA. The feds don't care about us. There were certainly ways that things could have gone smoother, but the reality is, when we really stand and sit here today, and if we're honest with ourselves, the reality is that we never had to ask ourselves, where is FEMA? When Hurricane Laura hit, there were boots on the ground. And though the reimbursement process can be cumbersome and maddening at times, thank God for it. Thank God for the process, because without FEMA, I truly don't know where the City of Lake Charles would be. And once again, just as I screamed at the top of my lungs about the delay for supplemental aid, just as I visited D.C. and Baton Rouge and pled our case, just as I called out the inexcusable delay when it was happening, I also believe in calling a spade a spade. And I now thank all of those federal officials, everyone on the federal level, our federal delegation, those individuals across 2 presidencies who helped ultimately get us the commensurate and equitable response that we needed. So the LC Resiliency Summit today would not be possible without support from several key sponsors, including Louisiana Radio Communications, Entergy, Vexus, HGA, Visit Lake Charles, Wagoner, and the Community Foundation, SWLA. Please join me in thanking our sponsors for today. So, ladies and gentlemen, we still have strides to make. I'll be the first to admit that. There are still many individuals, small businesses in this community who are struggling, but I am so proud of the strides that have been made over the last 4 years. And I humbly believe that this is a story worth telling. I thank you for being here today to hear how the story of Lake Charles occurred, like a phoenix from the ashes, and how we rose from the most weather-battered city in America to be one of the most resilient cities in America. Thank you. All right, sufficient inspiration for the morning. Now I'm going to turn it over to our Assistant City Administrator, Kimberly Delafosse, and I'm going to invite Gina Campo and Paul Rainwater to join me up here. Thank you, everybody, again.
Good morning. Kimberly Delafosse, as Mayor Hunter mentioned, I'm the Assistant City Administrator for the City of Lake Charles, and I will be serving as the moderator for the first session of the day, Navigating and Maximizing CDBG-DR. Okay, so we have an esteemed panel, so let's take a moment to introduce the panel to you guys. So first up, we have Ms. Gina Campo, Deputy Executive Director, Louisiana Office of Community Development, Disaster Recovery. Executive Director Campo is an accomplished leader with a strong background in public administration and community development. In her role as Chief Administrator of OCD Policy and Operations, she oversees its multiple disaster recovery programs, including the Restore Louisiana Homeowner Program and the Louisiana Watershed Initiative, as well as rental, housing, economic development, and infrastructure programs. Ms. Gina Campo. Next up, we have Mayor. Yeah. Next up, we have Mayor Nicholas Hunter, Mayor of the City of Lake Charles. A lifelong resident of Lake Charles, Nicholas Hunter was elected as mayor of Lake Charles in April of 2017 and is currently in his second term. Since taking office, he has championed initiatives to rebuild and strengthen the city in the wake of natural disasters while promoting economic development and inclusivity. Known for his hands-on leadership, and commitment to the people, Mayor Hunter continues to work tirelessly to create a brighter future for Lake Charles. And that I can absolutely attest to. Mayor Nicholas Hunter. And last and certainly not least, we have Mr. Paul Rainwater, Senior Consultant with Cornerstone Governmental Affairs. Paul Rainwater, now a Senior Consultant with Cornerstone Governmental Affairs, is a lifelong public servant with extensive experience in government and community leadership. Throughout his career, he has held key positions in both local and state government, where he has been instrumental in managing complex issues and driving significant policy changes. Paul Rainwater. Okay, so actually before we get started with today's panel, just a few reminders. If your phone is not on silent or vibrate, please make sure you adjust it to those settings. And we will have a question and answer segment at the end of the session. So each of you in your packet received a card like this. So if you have a question that you would like to address to the panel, please fill out the card with your question. And during the question and answer session, if you'll just hold it up, staff will come and take your card, and we will try to address as many questions as possible. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And we'll actually start the question and direct it to Ms. Campo. So tell us why it's important to understand the purpose and timing of CDBG-DR.
Sure. First of all, you have to understand where CDBG disaster recovery dollars fit into the total recovery package that is out there. Once there is a congressional appropriation of CDBG disaster recovery dollars, the state has to quantify the unmet need that is out there still in communities that are affected. And that's the key term, is unmet need. So the CDBG dollars that do come down when they finally do, sometimes it's in the case of Lake Charles, literally 2 years, September of 2028, November of 2028, when HUD actually signed off on the grant agreements for the CDBG-DR. Once that is done, it's acknowledging that there's an unmet need that was not filled by FEMA dollars, was not filled by small business loans, small business association loans, and was not filled by private insurance. So I think sometimes that gets lost in translation. These are not just additional dollars that can be tacked on to something that has already been covered or funded. So like I said, that's kind of where the distinction is between those initial dollars that come down via FEMA, via Small Business Association, and then also through private insurance. And so it's important to understand that when you're coming up with on a local level, your recovery plan, your long-term recovery plan.
Okay. And so we'll pivot back to the long-term plan in just a second. But Paul, if you'll walk us through the process, because it was a process.
How's this
Walk
happening?
us through the process and the politics of a disaster supplemental allocation.
Thank you, Kimberly, for that question. And I have to say that, whenever I'm back here, I just for a moment, I have a lot of history here. John Cordone reminded me that I stole a six-pack of beer from his house. During Hurricane Rita, I actually broke into his house to do that. Statute of limitations is up. John never pressed me. But I have a lot of history here, and so I've worked on a dozen disaster supplementals across the country for different states and different communities. And so when Sarah Judson called and Mayor Hunter called and said, "Hey, will you work with us on this, relief package?" I said, "Of course. I mean, we've got this down kind of pat." And we had just gone through the 2016 flood, where I represented the state of Louisiana at the White House and in Washington, D.C. And it was a transition between the Obama administration, the Trump administration. It went very well. So when Mayor Hunter and Sarah called, I said, "Okay, we got this." And so we kind of mapped it out, decided what our path was, and then nothing happened. And so the mayor, and he's right, I should have gotten a counseling degree because it would have really helped a lot. But it is one of those moments, and especially for me, coming from the area and feeling very confident about what the path was, there were some hiccups. And Casey Tingle and I were with the FEMA administrator yesterday, and she goes, "Oh, come on, Paul. There aren't red and blue states." Well, the reality of it is there are, right? And politics is just part of it. Because as we all know, these disaster community development block grant dollars, they're discretionary. And that is part of the challenge that Congress is having right now. But back to the politics and back to what happened, remember the country had a little bit of fatigue. They had the January 6th transition. So there was no one to transition with from our perspective on providing the data that Pat Forbes and Gina Campo had put together. And it really does take a team, a very strong team from the FEMA side, the HUD side, the Governor's Office, Homeland Security, the Office of Community Development, to create this narrative that you take to Washington, D.C., and you pitch. And you're basically pitching to the country, to members of Congress who are not from Louisiana, members of the White House staff who don't know where Lake Charles is at. You have to show them on a map. As Mayor Hunter says, it's just one of those things that you have to create the full picture And when people are distracted, as they were during that presidential transition in 2020, it just made it very difficult to get a consensus about what needed to happen. Now, obviously Hurricane Ida happens, which kind of, I told the mayor I'll never forget. But look, this is after 300 conversations with Mayor Hunter about whether or not this is going to happen or not, and conversations from a lot of people who were starting to question the strategy move. But there was a phone call that happened that the mayor was not involved with, but myself and Governor Edwards were involved with President-elect Biden. And it was set up, and it's just interesting. In my job, one of the things that you have to do is look for opportunities, and you look for people who care about the state. There's a gentleman named Alan Leventhal who is now the ambassador to Denmark. And Alan had built a Four Seasons hotel in New Orleans, and I happened to work with Alan on some taxing incentives. And Alan is one of these guys who's just super benevolent and cares about, if he operates in a state, he cares about the whole state. He said, look, he goes, I know that you're having trouble with this supplemental. I read this article, and this Mayor Hunter over in Lake Charles is like, he's putting out some pretty good points, and it kind of caught my attention. Would you and the governor, I'll set up a Zoom call with the president-elect, and let's talk about this. So when you do things like that, it just adds to the narrative, and it means other people care around the country. Because President Biden knew Alan Leventhal wasn't from Louisiana, but he knew he cared, and he knew there was something going on. So, and there's another person I'll mention, and it's Shalonda Young, the Office of Management and Budget Director for the United States. She's from Baker, Louisiana. Shalonda has served as the staff director on the Democratic side for many, many years, working through many disaster supplementals. Shalonda had it marked on a calendar saying, I am going to follow up on this day. I have not forgotten about Lake Charles, Louisiana. And I see that Mayor Hunter down there screaming and yelling, and the president's come into my office and said, let's get this done. So it's just and it was one of those awkward things, though, where, and you were very patient. You started your countdown, which kind of concerned me a little bit because, we were counting down the days. But,
We were counting up the days.
counting up the days. September, in 2021, we had $635 million, which, oh, by the way, to the mayor's credit, he was not happy with. And I don't blame him because, of course, I quickly pivoted to, well, this is a down payment, which he didn't buy, by the way, being a smart mayor and a smart politician. But we were able to go back again, and the country answered. And our delegation, every one of our delegation members were solid from day one, but it took other people in other parts of the country to kind of push it up. And so that's what took so long, unfortunately. But here we are now.
Right.
And the mayor's announcing things, and it's a very exciting time.
Another question, Paul. Has Congress considered making the Disaster Community Development Block Grant money more systematic so that there's less politics and less red tape with the process?
So when you talk to members of Congress and other parts of the country that aren't affected as much by large disasters, what they'll tell you is that the Stafford Act is what they point towards. The Stafford Act and the Federal Emergency Management Agency are the first line of defense on recovery, right, or first offense on recovery. And the federal budget this year is or 2023 was like $6.3 trillion. $6.3 trillion. Even the mic's responding to that number, I guess.
Is that me?
Paul was just speaking so many truths, the mic just could not take it. He blew the mic.
Well, I do have a loud voice, so I was a deputy commander, so I do have to speak loudly. So let's just kind of keep going. So as it relates to discretionary funding and the disaster recovery, how's that? Oh, there you go. The federal budget's like $6.3 trillion. As an example, the Department of Defense budget's about $800 billion. And so what you're starting to see, although I'll back up, Senator Susan Collins and Senator Bill Cassidy filed a bill a year and a half ago, that would create a formula around disaster supplemental funding for communities that have been hit by disasters. Senator Susan Collins has been a friend of Louisiana's and understands very well, what we've been through and what other parts of the country. Where the rub is at is other members of Congress that believe that the Stafford Act should be the final word on disaster recovery. All these dollars we get in disaster community development block grant money are considered discretionary. And members, are starting to push back. And I'll just give you a quick example. The fires in New Mexico, which were caused by the Bureau of Land Management. In New Mexico, they filed a request for disaster supplemental. Instead, they set up a claims office with $400 million and put the Stafford Act rules around it. Nothing against my FEMA friends, but as we all know, the Stafford Act is very rigid. Community development block grant money gives a community an opportunity to kind of dream and rebuild in a way that they never thought they could, right? As Mayor Hunter went through that line of projects that he has. But that's happening all over the country where you see disaster community development block grant money. So that fight's going to continue on whether or not, disaster community development block grant money continues to be discretionary or not. And so, we'll continue to work towards, because I believe it needs to be just like the Stafford Act. Like you pull it out and you allow a community the opportunity when they can prove it with an unmet need to use disaster community development block grant money to dream bigger than they could have ever dreamed before without that money.
So let's pivot a bit. So we know that there's just a bureaucracy to it all, and even as Congress attempts to adjust it, it's still what it is. So Mayor Hunter, speak to the importance, if you're speaking to another mayor or a parish administrator or a county commissioner, about telling the narrative, because it's your narrative that began to strike a chord.
Well, I think one of the most important things is make sure you have a good team around you, because one person and really one agency can't do it all by themselves. And look, we've got to face the realities that in a country the size of America, with some red states and blue states and congressional representation, perhaps heavier on some of the more heavily populated states, that a mayor of Lake Charles or a mayor of a mid-sized city is only going to have so much bandwidth. And so I do think that when we really rallied the community together, and it was more than just me, it was the police jury, it was the other cities, it was the community foundation. We launched Help Southwest Louisiana Now, is that what it was called? And we launched it in this building, and we really started to try to elevate the conversation, because we were worried that the media is there for a few days and then the media leaves. And I say this diplomatically, but the media likes a very, sexy, dramatic headline story. And when they came down here, the devastation was terrible, but they kind of realized, hey, they're kind of taking care of themselves down here. Let's move on to the next community that doesn't have their stuff together, because that's a better headline than people are taking care of each other. So I think it's putting together a good team. I think it's elevating the conversation as much as you can. We appealed to industry to help us. So many industries helped us. I got on phone calls. Jim Rock, thank you, Jim, who's another one of my heroes, set up individual phone calls with different industries, and we asked them to call their lobbyists and appeal to their members of Congress. And a shout out to the late, great Richard Zuschlag. I remember that he got on the phone with me and some elected officials that he knew in another state. And man, I'll just forever remember that conversation. But if I had advice to give, it would be surround yourself with a good team, make sure it's a community effort, and use absolutely every resource you have in connection to the federal government. Because if you try to do it in a silo, alone, with just one office or one agency, it will be a challenge.
Yes. And to that point, we learned some lessons as a city, right? So what advice would you give, once again, to a city leadership team, knowing that as disasters increase, federal allocations might be delayed, probably, maybe even more so than Lake Charles is? What would a city need to know and how to be prepared?
Well, I would actually like to piggyback a little bit on what Paul said. I am one that believes there should be a Stafford Act or Bible for CDBG-DR, and I think if there was ever a poster child for the example of a community that needed CDBG-DR, it would be what Lake Charles went through in 2020 and 2021. So I would continue to advocate to Congress that FEMA has a role and a place, but there are times when you get hit by 4 federally declared natural disasters over a 10-month span where the Stafford Act reaches its limitations or how much it can help. I would also encourage other elected officials, this a little bit more on the FEMA side, but don't only start thinking about this stuff when the disaster hits. Start thinking about it on sunny days. And I am very thankful that I had a team around me that went through Hurricane Rita. There was a lot of institutional knowledge, a lot of lessons learned from 20 years ago that were used in 2020. And especially as it relates to FEMA push packages, pre-approved packages. We had a lot of those in 2020. We have a lot more today because of what we learned. There were some things that we went through that if we could have picked up a phone call and told a vendor, get over here with your pre-approved package, and FEMA's going to reimburse it, we learned those lessons. So I would encourage elected officials to think about these things on the sunny days, not just the dark days. And then in the aftermath, make sure you're sticking to a message and take some personal, spiritual alone time every now and then. Put your cell phone aside, hang out with your family every now and then, and just get away from it every now and then because it can eat you up.
Yes. Ms. Campo, you mentioned the long-term recovery plan. How does that plan play into a city or municipality's ability to recoup the funds that HUD will allocate?
Sure. So, and I'm going to leverage what the mayor just said. So it's to access and maximize your CDBG dollars, you really do need to be prepared. And I know a lot of us don't like the word plans because plans do sit on the shelf a lot. And I'm coming from this as more so from a local government standpoint than from a state government standpoint, having administered disaster recovery dollars on the local level for 10 years. So the way you are successful in maximizing CDBG-DR, maximizing other grant funds that do come down after a disaster is you have your plan. And the plan isn't just, we want to recover and we want to focus on infrastructure and we want to mitigate. It has to actually have teeth. It has to be implementable. Shovel ready, those words all are floated around and people think they have no meaning. But the more that you can be prepared to take your project or your program and launch as soon as possible, you're going to be able to maximize dollars. And as a state administrator, we're looking for those communities that do have those implementable programs and plans, that do have that vision, that come to us and say, look what we can do, because we have to ensure that these dollars are utilized efficiently, effectively, and to the maximum, and also within a certain time period. So you have the need for this pre-planning, which as on the local level, I always, I saw this as a seamless thing. So I was in St. Tammany Parish, and we got hit and hit and hit and hit every 4 years or whatever it was, and the recovery just blended together, quite frankly. And so it became part of our natural budgeting and planning process. And I know that that doesn't sound very appetizing, but it really did position us to be in a place where once dollars were coming down and were available, to say, hey, look at us, we can implement this. We can implement this in time, and et cetera. And I would say utilize folks that have done this before. You don't want to have to recreate the wheel when you're in a situation that is, dire. You just were hit, you were hit a year or two ago, and now this money's coming down, and you really don't know. We're getting to the point where, like, we're almost 20 years out post Katrina, right? And so a lot of the folks that lived that are not doing this anymore, and it's kind of it's a brain drain. It's a good thing in some ways because you have a new perspective, but you also need that institutional knowledge to be able to move through effectively, et cetera. So, get a good partner, call another entity in your area that is in the same situation. Call me. I'll give you advice all day long. Because I've been through the school of hard knocks with the FEMA and HUD, so that's not a problem. I encourage you to reach out and ask questions. But yes, you have to have a plan. And a couple more things. Please. I would suggest that you keep in mind things like HUD is going to be providing the funding that they do when Congress gets there. But it's going to be limited. It's going to be limited. Right now, we are limited to serving folks that are low to moderate income, and 70% of our grant funds of $3.12 billion for Laura Delta Ida have to go to low to moderate income. And so that is that's a known quantity that needs to be addressed up front in your planning process. It's not going to change. You're not going to have waivers like you did back in Katrina and for certain disasters thereafter where HUD, said, okay, well, 50%, et cetera. This is a hard and fast thing, number one. And it can be challenging when you have infrastructure projects that you're trying to qualify as eligible in low to moderate income situation. So keep that in mind. The other thing that I think is important to note is that mitigation or resilience is also something that HUD is looking for and encouraging and requiring, actually, in their Federal Register notices, which is essentially the guidance that they provide for any individual supplemental disaster funding that's awarded. But they're requiring that the state do a certain level of mitigation or resilience. So you'll see our programs requiring not only additional elevation requirements over and above, there's a caveat there, but also fortified building standards, green building standards, et cetera. And these aren't things that the state just said, oh, well, I think this is a good idea. We're required to do these things by the federal government. So make sure that that is built into your plan also. Identify areas that need to be bought out, need to be elevated. Get that work done ahead of time, and you'll be positioned to utilize the funds that are available best.
And the fortified gold standards, I think, that was a federal requirement, right?
Yes.
I think it was a good thing. It was a good thing forcing people to use federal money to build back to be as strong as we know how to do it.
Correct.
And so you mentioned something, Ms. Campo, which made me think about staff and municipality staff and the capacity. As FEMA changes, evolves, HUD evolves, CDBG-DR is evolving, even organizations with institutional knowledge may find themselves challenged. So how are small cities or even larger cities going to deal with staff capacity, or how do you suggest they deal with staff capacity in addressing these ever-changing programs?
Yeah. That's a tough one because we deal with it all every day. A lot of the programs that we're doing right now have local allocations that are providing project money to local cities and towns, et cetera, directly to fund their projects. And they clearly are at a disadvantage, quite frankly, not because they don't have the ability to get there, but because we really need our grantees to be ready to use those funds, right? So we encourage grantees, and we provide part of this in our grant funding to obtain contract services. I know it doesn't sound like something, I don't want to spend it on that. I don't want to spend my money on a contract consultant. I want to put the money in, dirt, right? I want to turn dirt. I want to put my money in the project. But in order to jump through all the hoops, and if you don't have staff with that historical knowledge, that capacity, it's really at that time too late to build capacity, if that makes sense. I'm not saying you shouldn't use that as an opportunity, but you really need to look at seriously getting a consultant that is well-versed. And, like I said, talk to other jurisdictions. What did you do? Who did you use? You do have to procure it, obviously, as per federal guidelines, but, you need to be comfortable with who it is that is, selected and who you're working with, and et cetera. So, get feedback from others on that before you make your decision.
Right. And Mayor Hunter alluded during your welcome to HGA and the work and support that HGA as a consultant has added to Lake Charles's plate of response. And can you speak to that just a bit more?
Sure, and there's a lot. There's a lot of them out there. So I called out HGA because they're who we chose, and I think we made the right choice. But there's a lot of firms out there. Unfortunately, in Louisiana, we've had a lot of experience with natural disasters, and there's a lot of firms that have been through the ringer. And I do think that the institutional knowledge going as far back as Katrina is important and relevant, but I've also found, I think we can all admit, that things have changed a lot in FEMA and HUD over the last 10 years.
Yep.
And so finding firms that have been involved in recent storms, I think, is also really important. And our team had been involved in Sandy, in Puerto Rico recovery from Irma, and that was beneficial because they could say, hey, this is a little bit more up to date about how they would do things. And I remember hearing about all the stories about how things happened in Katrina, and I remember saying, like, hey, Tyson, man, why can't we just do what they did with Katrina back then? And he said, man, there's no more free lunches. They don't do that anymore. There's no more free lunches. And so there's a lot of good firms out there. And as Gina said, get yourself a good consultant.
Did you want to add to that, Gina?
No, I think that's
Okay.
that's spot on. There has been an evolution in how FEMA and HUD DR is administered, the rules, the regulations, and just the process itself. So that's a very good point. And that's why I said, it's almost a good thing that you have that fresh set of eyes, that, folks that are newly, in this business or responding to newer disasters, because it is a little bit different than folks that were in the trenches during Katrina.
So we're winding down, so we have spectacular knowledge up here. I know that you all can sense that and hear that in their responses. So I would be remiss if I didn't allow them to give at least one just really solid bit of advice to those of you in attendance. So Paul, I'll start with you. Advice for a municipality challenged with a natural disaster, not just a hurricane, any natural disaster. What's your advice for them?
So for the community, it's, and I've always believed this, it's about leadership. In this particular case, the city of Lake Charles has one resilient leader, and that's Mayor Nick Hunter. It also has some super resilient community groups like Jim Rock and Sarah Judson, and just really strong fabric in the community that has survived and has, has the patience to work through some very difficult issues. And then it's got an old guy, John Cardone, and I have a lot of respect for John. John's been with the city for a very long time, but, John is, he's like the Mike Webster that's Pittsburgh Steelers, by the way, a center for Terry Bradshaw. He's like that center that never goes away. He's a Pro Bowler, right? And he's a solid guy, but it's about resilient leadership. That's the bottom line. And if you have resilient leaders, if you look across the country, which I do, and I work across the country, when you have a resilient leader, you can tell it, you can smell it, you feel it, because they're metric driven and they're on your butt every day about what's going to happen. And Mayor Hunter's that kind of leader. So I'll just say that.
Absolutely. John Maxwell says everything rises and falls on leadership. So thank you. Mayor Hunter, bit of advice.
I think I kind of covered it a moment ago with other communities. I would just say don't wait until the disaster hits to start getting ready, and make sure you're surrounding yourself with the right people. And I will tell one more story about Paul. I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to use any names, but Sarah Judson and I, we were on a couple conversations with a couple other individuals. We were trying to decide who we wanted to go with. And we had a couple calls with people who said, man, I can get on the cell phone right now and I can call Donald Trump, no problem. And we got off the call with a couple of those guys and we felt like, I don't know, they seemed a little greasy. And and again, I'm not going to say any names, but you can Google a couple of these guys and they've had some legal troubles over the last couple of years. So I remember when we were on the call with Paul, and I said on that call, Sarah, Paul was on the call too, I can be coy, I can say, let's take some time to think about it, but look, this is my guy. This is who I think we should go with. And it wasn't only Paul's connection here, it was just the way he presented himself, and he was very honest, and he kind of gave us a path forward, but he didn't overpromise. And so again, I think it's moments like that in the aftermath of what you go through where you surround yourself with the right people, make the right decisions. Just because your brother-in-law's friend has a buddy from college that says, I know the DR world like the back of my hand, that doesn't mean anything. And there's a few other stories out there of some people that probably wish they would have taken a little more time and been a little more methodical about the help and the team they put around them.
Absolutely. And last, Ms. Campo, advice for communities.
I don't think I can top what they said. It's everything they said. No, get a plan, a real plan, an executable plan, an implementable plan, if I can say it, and get help. Get help. Call. Find somebody. Like, I'll answer your call. Not every state administrator will answer your call, but find that person that will answer your call. We really want to hear what your input is, and when you find that person, make your case, and that's probably the most effective thing that you can do. Advocate for yourself.
And as you said a moment ago, nobody likes to spend FEMA or DR money on the admin costs, but for small cities, even a city size like Charles, it's almost impossible to hire people.
Right.
And pay them to be up to date on this
Correct.
stuff. So really, you end up maximizing and probably getting more money in the end and a better bang for your buck by just hiring a good consultant, paying them the admin fees. And I think that's one thing that FEMA has done right since Katrina. I think at Katrina, they just sent, hundreds of FEMA employees down, and they were like, okay, you go talk to these cities and y'all figure it out. But now it's a little more FEMA dealing with the consultant. So the consultants are almost a little bit like an extension of FEMA, kind of a middleman, and as opposed to just government employees going down and trying to put all these formulas together, it's really the consultant working with FEMA. And I like that process. I think it's a better process than what it was 20 years ago.
Yes. Okay, so we'll start with some questions. If you have any questions, raise your card, and like I said, staff will pick up that card from you. Make sure you have good handwriting, even with my glasses. Okay, so this question is from Dale DeSagne, who's a citizen here in Lake Charles, and the question is addressed for you, Paul. The question asks, do the community recipients of state and federal monies ever have to submit a report about how the funds were used with verification?
Not the individuals themselves. There are, now I will tell you that, Ms. Campo and her team are really great at accounting for dollars. And so when the Southwest Louisiana Foundation, Community Foundation, or the mayor, or whoever uses the money, there is a reconciliation that occurs at the state level. And eventually, HUD comes in, the HUD Inspector General comes in, along with the Homeland Security Inspector General, and there's a reconciliation that goes on. And there's this thing called clawbacks, which, as a consultant, I know Tyson Hackenberg doesn't like that word, clawback, because that means that they got to pay money back. So yes, there is a reconciliation that occurs, and it's something that, I've worked through, a bunch of times, and I know Gina has as well, and they have a really strong team. They work along with Louisiana Legislative Auditor and others to make sure that those dollars are being spent. And just real quick, not to belabor the point, but what Gina's team is really good at doing, I think, and so are the Governor's Office of Homeland Security, is trying to get ahead of some of that and doing pre-audits so that, if you've got sub-grantees from the city down to a foundation or a nonprofit, there's some work that's going on at a grassroots level to help them understand like what the right way is to account for these dollars and what the dollars can be used for.
Thank you. All right, next question. It's actually directed to you, Ms. Campo, and this comes from Nicole Miller with the Calcasieu Parish Police Jury. The question is, due to the delayed arrival of CDBG-DR funding, the Homeowner Restore Program had an extremely low number of homeowner applicants. How has OCD pivoted to assist homeowners with DR funding who got lost in 2 years of waiting?
That's a very good question. So it is a challenge. I have, looked at some options about trying to get the information, number one, like trying to validate that information through the various and sundry public meetings we had, pinpointing individuals through the FEMA database information, which is really what we focused on in order to do our outreach, to determine eligibility, et cetera. And how could folks actually fall through the cracks, right? And then once we do identify those folks, what can we do about it? And so I've been tasked with going out and finding if there is still unmet need, right? And so I've been trying, since I came back into the office in January in my new role, trying to validate that. But at this point in the game, it's very elusive, quite frankly. It's been very difficult to find that population. And so we really rely on community partners in order to to identify those individuals and assist them. And quite frankly, we want to work with community partners to do that heavy lift, especially on folks that are maybe not the key population that are going to be assisted by the Restore program. The Restore program initially was rolled out with a higher damage, FEMA verified loss damage level, and we reduced it several times in order to get to where we are, which I believe is $3,000 in FEMA verified losses, which is pretty low. I do know that the longer you get from a disaster, the less likely folks are going to avail themselves of that. But for right now in Lake Charles, we have offered about $90 million in grants to about 1,200 homeowners. And this is just the homeowner portion of the Restore program. And we've dispersed about $42 million of that so far. So we're making strides. We always are happy to try and get people connected with additional assistance. I just feel like it's been elusive. It's been difficult to find that population. Right now, it's basically onesie twosies. And when we do identify someone, we try to get them connected with a community foundation, with Louisiana Housing Corporation, who have a lot of contacts that can help those individuals. So don't give up. Contact us. We will find someone that can help you, even if it's not the Restore Louisiana program.
Okay, thank you. So this question isn't addressed to any specific panelist, so anyone who wants to answer, please feel free. The question is asked by Mr. Brett Krieger from the Louisiana Municipal Association. And the question is it important to establish and document needs during the FEMA claims period so it can be demonstrated as an unmet need many months later if FEMA doesn't meet the need?
You take that.
So, thank you, Mayor, for, I'll be happy to answer that. The unmet need is kind of everything. I mean, it just is. And that conversation, and just real quick, so what happens is so when you're working with the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and the Office of Community Development to develop that unmet need, then you kind of push that up. And there is some scrutiny that goes on between the Federal Emergency Management Agency and there's this undersecretary in HUD who does nothing but calculations. That's all they do, and they plug your number in to, what is, I think, an artificial intelligence computer somehow that pops out what you believe, and then you kind of debate that number. But because of the nature of the way supplementals work, it's super important to capture data as even if it's a couple years down the road. There was outside of Louisiana, there was a community called Dougherty, Georgia they'd experienced some floods. 4 years later, we were able to get them like $50 million. I don't want to put an idea in your mind, Mayor.
Another $50 million 4 years later?
Well, but to cover some costs associated with the destruction of a building. But because we had documented it so well, and because FEMA agreed with it, you have to have an agreement between the Federal Emergency Management and the HUD, and I can't tell you how important it is to have your state partners like GINA and Governor's Office of Homeland Security on board with that concept, because it doesn't go anywhere unless you have them bought into it, because the worst thing you can do is push something up that everyone's not agreed to. So yes, it's super important.
Another thing I would mention that was different about this is because of COVID, FEMA was using a lot of drones and virtual damage assessments. And I'm sorry, but you're not going to get the full scope of a damaged home unless you visit it in person. And that was, I don't know, I hope there were some lessons learned by FEMA on that. I pray to God we're never in that situation again as a country, but you're not going to get a full picture of damages by flying a drone over a neighborhood. And I really thank you guys for lowering the threshold, because we still believe that FEMA undervalued the damages that were in a lot of these homes. And that was a major hurdle to a lot of people getting help. And once y'all lowered that threshold, it opened the door for a lot more people to get help.
Okay, so Mayor Hunter, I'm going to summarize this question, and it doesn't have a person's name identified. It just basically asks for you to speak to how the housing response is going to help the workforce here in Southwest Louisiana.
As I said in my opening remarks, and these are real numbers, this is not just hyperbole, again, in about 6 months, when some of these developments that are under construction come online, we will have more rental units in the city of Lake Charles than we had pre-Hurricane Laura. Additionally, the fortified gold standards, I can't tout that enough, and I'm very, very proud of that. So I believe that the stock is there, it's returning. I'm a believer in, allowing the private industry to respond. I think there are things that government can do to encourage, entice, but I do believe that the private industry is going to realize, and has already realized to some extent, that we've got a lot of housing coming back online. And even with some of my conversations with Gina, I've been very specific with areas, some geographic, but also the type of housing that I think we really need to focus on today. So things like the Choice Neighborhood Initiative and that grant, anything we can do more to support that is a good thing, because that's not just housing, it's completely transformational in my opinion. But the single-family homes, getting some of these single-family homes rebuilt on infill lots, because there's been a lot of homes torn down in Lake Charles over the last 4 years. That's something that we're very focused on. But I believe that today, the housing, the attainability of housing in Lake Charles is leagues better than it was 3 years ago. I don't want to go off on a bunny trail, but I would say if you asked me 3 years ago, what was my number one concern for the city of Lake Charles, I would have said housing. Today, it's insurance, and that, I think we'll talk about that later, so I won't get into that. But the amount of housing that has come online and is about to come online is putting this city in a much better place than we were 3 years ago, and probably in a better place than we've been in the last 10 or 15 years.
Absolutely. Okay, so this question is from Mr. Scott Benedict, and the entire panel can address. So the question asks, being at ground zero, how is McNeese State University involved in learning and implementing improved strategies for preparedness and future recoveries to be implemented here and elsewhere? But maybe this might be more Mayor Hunter.
I can answer it a little bit, and then you worked with McNeese as well. And actually, I hate to do this, but I'm going to also include Sewella in that conversation. It's not just McNeese. It's McNeese and Sewella. Both those campuses mean so much to this community, and the innovation that is taking place on those campuses is pretty inspiring. I mentioned the grant program that Sewella has that is teaching and training workforce of the construction skills of the 21st century in a disaster-prone community. McNeese is putting a lot of focus on LNG and a lot of forward thinking and innovation towards LNG. But Dr. Roos is new. He's bringing some fresh blood and fresh ideas to the table. So I'm optimistic about McNeese's future. I would encourage everybody in this room and everybody in this community to wrap your arms around McNeese and give them as much love as we can. They are facing challenges that regional colleges around this country are facing, and they're doing it in an environment that's been affected by so many natural disasters. But I'm optimistic about the future of the campus and the things going on there.
I mean, as you said, Mayor, the reality of it is, McNeese, like so many university campuses, has gone through COVID, then the 4 events. Dr. Darrell Burkell, who was the leader there, is another resilient guy, right, who just stuck with it and just, worked a little bit at a time every day to bring the campus back, working with his federal partners at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And, the new campus president is actually living in the dorm until the president's house is repaired with the students. And so that's the kind of leadership you need, and that's the kind of thing that's going to help McNeese survive in this very challenging, and I see Adam Knapp. Adam can talk about higher ed more than I can for days, but the reality of it is the challenges for higher education, take out the storm, take out COVID, create online, and I don't, we're not here to talk about this, but online programming and the challenges of what's happening in universities across the country. The reality of it is McNeese is still Cowboy strong. It reaches out to its community. It does a great job. I remember a moment at which, after one of the hurricanes, the president reached out to me because it couldn't house the girls' soccer team. So a bunch of community people kind of got together and figured out a way to raise money to keep them in a hotel so they could play in their games. That's what helps a community survive. That's what's going to help McNeese survive. And it's the same thing I said earlier. It's about local leadership, and you have that here.
Well, thank you, everyone. This has been a very informative panel, and I'd like you all to give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you.